You're okay. You're listening to INTERZONE Pod. My name is Gareth Jelly. I'm the editor of INTERZONE and INTERZONE Digital. Today I'm talking to Nick Lowe, author of the long-running Mutant Popcorn series of film criticism. And we have a lot to talk about. Hi, Nick. Thanks for coming on.
Fantastic to be back, and we do indeed have a huge amount to talk about.
We've been talking a little bit earlier, and it's kind of 2023 has been a really sort of unexpectedly rich year for science fiction cinema, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this was the I think I said this in the last column, that supposedly Hollywood died. We had this perfect storm of two strikes, lots of key features like the Dune sequel getting kicked into 2024. The streaming model was starting to take on water, particularly at Disney, who had a generally pretty terrible year on a number of fronts, and were forced into a big rethink of their business strategy. We were getting films that were already completed dumped and written off at Warner's. And yet, when you look back on the year, it's hard to think of any year which has had so many absolutely, 5-star plus films. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them have come from out of the blue, from the international world, from the indie sector, and occasionally we've had big studio numbers which have completely blown the doors off. I mean, nobody saw Barbenheimer coming. They saw a film, two rather risky-looking films that, I think we can look back on and say neither of them was sort of entirely there, but that actually turned out to be a box office phenomenon for a generation. So an amazing year. I mean, it's kind of a little 1982 all over again.
And for listeners who maybe don't remember 1982, what do you most remember from that year?
Well, that was the year, it would have been a good year on all fronts, but we remember it as the year of The Thing, Blade Runner, Wrath of Khan was that year, and of course the one that completely changed the world was E.T. And at the time we thought, this is just another typical year for SF. Some of those films did not do well at the box office, but particularly, The Thing and Blade Runner were they didn't exactly tank. They were certainly seen as underperforming, and they are now absolutely iconic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting which films kind of come back and are remembered and which ones aren't, for sure.
Yeah, I always get it wrong. I never spot the classics when they happen. I remember watching The Princess Bride and thinking, I think I've talked about this with you, and thinking, this is not going to do well. It's only sort of 30% as good as the book, which I think is probably still true. But nevertheless, people, 30% as good as the book, The Princess Bride, is pretty good. It has complete. I mean, I don't know if anyone even reads the novel now. They should, because it's great. But the film has now become the iconic version of that story. And at the time, everyone who was a fan of the book saying, of course, this is completely unfilmable. It's all dependent on purely textual devices. And it's interesting I've been thinking about that a lot while thinking about Poor Things, which is one of the films of the year, perhaps the film of the year. And again, is a film of an unfilmable novel, whose unfilmability is all about the novelisticness of it and the textiness of it. But it's quite clear already that it's, even though it hasn't really had much in the way of public screenings. There was one. It's done the festival circuit. There was one in London last night, an audience screening, but it still hasn't had a proper release. And that is clearly going to clean up and become. Unfortunately, I think to displace the novel. We'll be talking about that one later.
Yeah, we'll talk about that one soon. I was just looking at 1982, and it was also Tron.
Tron, of course, that was the other one I've forgotten. Yeah, it is the benchmark year in SF film. 1999 is often bandied as a competitor, and was obviously an important year. But 82 is still the one to beat. And in fairness, I don't think we've got 5 films that quite look like E.T., Blade Runner, Tron, The Thing, Wrath of Khan. But I think we've probably got 5 films that are as good as those 5.
And we do have a Shatner link later. Well, I mean, maybe that's the...
Well, yeah.
Maybe that's the segue.
All right, let's do it.
From Wrath of Khan to your cutting room floor for INTERZONE 296.
Yes, well, 296 was one of we had this unexpected end of year bulge, largely from the festival round. A lot of the stuff isn't out yet, and in some cases hasn't got distributors. But there was an unexpectedly huge amount of material for 296, and although I really thought I wasn't going to leave anything on the cutting room floor, there were, as usual, 3 films that just didn't fit, either because their adjacency to genre wasn't quite a fit for our usual coverage, or simply because they my usual thing, they would have taken too long to explain, and a lot of the explanation wouldn't really have been about the film. But one of them, an old friend of this podcast, actually, because poor guy, his last film also made the cutting room floor, is the great Canadian fan documentarist Alexandre O, Philippe, latest feature, You Can Call Me Bill, which is an interview doc with William Shatner. His last feature, of course, was Lynch Oz, which we talked about on, I think, the very first INTERZONE podcast. And of course, he's carved out a niche for himself as this master of the fan documentary. So many people will know his Memory, the Origins of Alien. And he has a signature. He's an absolute master of fair use archive footage, and doing these quite low budget documentary features that are nevertheless absolutely kind of stuffed with astounding clips in brilliantly montaged, brilliantly fitted to the story that he's telling. There's a kind of Adam Curtis level of expertise with archive footage, and the thing about so his Shatner doc is called You Can Call Me Bill, which the really nerdy people will recognise as his entrance line from his cameo on The Big Bang Theory. And it's born of sitting Shatner down for 3 days and in a quite a cleverly planned way, sort of lighting him from different angles according to the different themes. Like a lot of his films, it's divided into chapters, which were part of the initial interview structure. And it's getting Shatner to talk about being Shatner. And a lot of what makes it a remarkable film is not really to do with what one would expect of a Shatner documentary. It's about being an actor in the, I think it's fair to say, very late stages of a very long career. A statistic that just blows your head off to contemplate is that he has been acting for 86 years. And he's still extremely articulate and extremely active. He's still doing kind of 4 engagements a day. He does not stop. And there is something rather strange about that life and that person. He's an immensely larger than life character who is very serious about a lot of things, including horses and environmental causes. But the thing that makes it is this Philippian mastery of archive footage. So very early on, you're thinking, well, this is not like his other films. It's a kind of talking head picture about becomes increasingly clear he's quite a strange man. But then you get this montage of Shatner death scenes spanning the decades of his career, and you think, okay, this is our guy again. This is the directorial stamp put on it, and it's absolutely wonderful. It's a treat to watch, and goes to some really quite dark places. There was one day when he'd had a bad morning on his horse, and that's the day when he's talking in very frank ways about how lonely it is being someone who spends his life basically performing, being other people, being a different version of himself for the public, and how he, at least on that day, felt he'd never really had any friends, despite being this incredibly gregarious performer. So an absolute must-watch. I don't know if it's got distribution yet, but that was one I saw at the London Film Festival, which had something like 20 SF films. It was an extraordinary year for this kind of festival-friendly SF adjacent stuff, but I mean, everything Philippe does is unmissable, and this was a real, I mean, both a departure for him and actually a great kind of showcase for taking the skills he already has and applying them to a very different kind of film.
Yeah, and the Lynch Oz pod is definitely worth a listen, but the film, most importantly, is just amazing.
Yeah. No, I mean, everything he does is fantastic. He did a documentary about Klingon. So I think Shatner has or Trek fandom has been on his radar for a long time, and this was and Shatner is extremely cooperative in the interviews. He didn't really try to exercise any kind of control. It's not spun. It's not. I mean, he executive produced it, but he didn't really try to intervene in the narrative, and it's it is a terrific documentary just about being an actor in with a very, very long career crossing genres.
Yeah. Did you see the video? There was a video going around of he'd just gone in. Shatner had just come back from space.
Yes, that's in the film. Yeah,
and there was a clip going around of Bezos comes over, and Shatner sort of starts to talk very sort of very emotionally about how how he felt, and then Bezos just can't pay attention, turns off to the side, sort of shouts like, "Where's the champagne? Where's the champagne?" Completely, and then Shatner just sort of, you can see his face kind of drop, and he's not going to get to say what he wanted to say, and it's just, and I saw that, and I saw, yeah, and just the sadness, yeah, the sort of he really just wanted to talk just for a really short time about how he felt going into space, and Bezos just was thinking about something completely different.
Yeah, well, Bezos is not in the he's rightly edited out of the sequence in the feature. I mean, it gives good space to that moment, because it is a moment, of course. I think many of us, we've seen Shatner play himself in many contexts, but that was one of the most genuine sequences where you really actually got to see his emotional interior, and you get quite a lot of that in this film. That, I think, must have been one of the things that persuaded Philippe to give it a shot.
Great. That's so yeah. You can call me Bill. Hopefully, streaming somewhere or getting a general release soon.
Yeah. Shall we continue with the cutting room floor while we're in that?
Yeah, definitely.
Bit of that. So one that I was so tempted to include, not least because this was, I think, the single largest collection of really interesting adaptations of really interesting SF texts that we've ever had in a single issue. But in the end, well, for reasons that will become clear, I couldn't really make space for was Suitable Flesh, which is a Shudder title that's had limited theatrical releases, certainly in the US and in the UK, and I don't think it's on Shudder yet. I think you have to rent it. But this is a gender-flipped adaptation of Lovecraft's The Thing on the Doorstep, one of the sort of B-list great stories, and it's a Stuart Gordon tribute. It's a story that Gordon had been developing as a feature at the time he fell ill, and features a lot of the old team who go all the way back to Reanimator and From Beyond, and the golden days of Empire Pictures in the 80s. So it's written by Dennis Powley, who of course was the writer on all Gordon's Lovecraft features, and it's done very much. Barbara Crampton is in it, and in a major role, and Brian Yuzna is involved as well. It's got a lot of the gang back together, and it's taking Lovecraft's story, but also the heritage of Stuart Gordon's interpretation of Lovecraft stories, which has always been quite sort of balls out, and trying to recreate that sensibility in a slightly more kind of 2023 way, in a way that Gordon would have been proud of. I have my own kind of take on Stuart Gordon, who of course did not just do Lovecraft adaptations, or that's what he's remembered for, mostly in film. I mean, he did stuff like Fortress and Space Truckers along the way. But I think in the end he may be remembered more for his theatre work. He was always very much a theatre guy, and his company, the Organic Theatre, which I think started out at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, but established itself in Chicago, and for which he was basically plucked to make Reanimator. It was kind of the US equivalent. It was the great sort of foundational SF theatre troupe, corresponding, I suppose, to Ken Campbell's Science Fiction Theatre of Liverpool in the UK, and he never stopped doing theatre all through his life. But obviously he does have this very specific film legacy as the great sort of B-movie interpreter of Lovecraft. And this is very directed by the very experienced horror director Joe Lynch, but with, as I say, a lot of the old team on it. And the thing that Lynch brought to it, which was not part of Gordon's early development, was to flip the genders of the characters. So if you know the thing on the doorstep, this is the one, this is the demon possession one, where the narrator's best friend is we would say these days he is seduced into an abusive relationship with this mysterious half Innsmouth woman who turns out, in fact, to be possessed by the spirit of her sorcerer father, who is hopping from body to body to keep himself alive. And in the story, the sort of body hopping spirit kind of increasingly takes possession of the hapless groom's body. And Lovecraft obviously has problems about what you would actually do if you're taking over someone's body, and so he just sort of goes off to cult meetings of secret societies. Although I read it again when the film was screening, and I'd forgotten there were actually shoggoths in it. And one of the things I rather miss about the film is that there are no shoggoths, and in fact the whole kind of cosmic horror side of it, which actually gets most of the best passages in the story, aren't really there. It's much more down to earth, but it does culminate in this amazing moment where the original inhabitant of the body has to reanimate his corpse after he's been evicted permanently, and that's the thing on the doorstep that turns up and persuades the hero to go and shoot his best friend in the asylum. And so all this has been gender flipped, and so now it's Heather Graham and Barbara Crampton as two psychologist colleagues confronted with this they're both psychotherapists, and they're confronted with this patient who seems to be manifesting as a dissociative personality, but we know is being possessed by by this centuries-old body-hopping demon that has got into him through his dad, and now is into these two women. And the finale. So it goes through a lot of quite ingeniously devised, although not terribly well written, sex scenes where the demon is kind of hopping between bodies during sex, and it's got some interesting kind of spins on the original premise, but it does reinterpret the finale as an action sequence. In action stage, in fact, I think it's only the exteriors that are the same, but in the same building that played the same Miskatonic University sanatorium back in Reanimator. So it's doing a lot of the Gordonian things, but with this interesting kind of female-centered twist to it, and a lot of it is a bit clunky until the finale comes together, which I think was all shot on a single day and is really very bold in the way it kind of stages Mind's sort of the demon hopping between bodies in a shootout, basically, which is a terrific idea for a set piece. But to have written this up would have involved an enormous amount of explaining who Stuart Gordon was and why his Lovecraft films in particular are an important tradition that one might want to homage in 2023. But well worth catching. I mean, it does. I was thinking for a lot of it, this isn't really doing it, but actually it does come together very well at the end.
And you said that's available to rent. Suitable Flesh is available to rent on Shudder.
Yes, I mean, I think it's going to be on Shudder sometime in the new year, but at the moment you can just rent it from your usual rental services. I think it's on general VOD.
Okay, and then there's one more got left on the floor.
Yes, the other one that bit the dust for slightly different reasons was the Irish film Apocalypse Clown, which is not really like anything else. This is. This was back in the summer now, so it was, I think everyone had kind of forgotten about it, but it actually deserves checking out. So this is a little Irish feature funded by the Irish TV license fee, so presumably essentially made with TV money, and certainly every euro is up there on screen, and there aren't very many of them. But this is this is an Irish post-apocalypse, an Irish apocalypse comedy centered on a clown funeral. The clowning community is gathered in a rural village to mark the passing of one of their own at the exact moment that there is this blackout, and civilization appears to have gone completely down. And so you have, it's not really about clowns, it's about what would happen if the apocalypse were to happen in rural Ireland, where, of course, the thing about Ireland is that there is a big kind of gap between the urban and the rural information transmission rate, and so in Dublin, where the female lead is a reporter for something called Viral Load Media. It would be much clearer what's going on, but out there in the sticks, nobody knows whether this really is the apocalypse, and how much of civilization has survived. And so they go into Mad Max mode and take out all their long boiling clown feuds. And a lot of it, the thing that saves it is that it is actually really sharply written, and played, actually. The lead is David Earl, who was not only in but also co-wrote Brian and Charles last year, and has that kind of sad sack personality that works very well as someone whose life has been spent as a clown very unsuccessfully. And there's a lot of good gags about clowns going scary. This is apparently a syndrome that will strike if you clown too much, you turn into Pennywise. And so there's this wonderful supporting character who has gone full scary. And it's, it has wonderfully Irish set pieces and Irish jokes about emotional support horses and kind of post-apocalyptic schlepping across a peat bog. So it is kind of joyous, despite being the most low-budget thing ever, and a really stupid idea. I think only Irish television would fund it. The villain has a tank, who is a bad clown, has a tank labelled Industrial Custard, and it's in the end it's more a film about the concept of the apocalypse as an Irish. As it would happen in Ireland, than it is really about clowns, and it's got this terrible title, which I don't think would really have sold it particularly. But it's full of very good jokes and worth checking out. It's one of these things that is more kind of SF adjacent and riffing off SF tropes than it is really a kind of proper SF film. But I had a good time at it.
I'm intrigued by all three of those, in very different ways. But a viral load, I can't quite get over that.
Yeah, well, this is very much an emerging from the pandemic film, and
Right, right.
it's not really about that. It is about um, what happens if society goes down. I mean, this is an apocalypse that arises from a collapse of electronic media,
Hmm.
especially, and the way in which in Ireland that cuts the villages off from the city. You know, the only news that comes through to them is that Garth Brooks, the country singer, is dead. He's supposed to be playing this big um, uh, uh, concert in Dublin, and the nation goes into mourning, and we know the apocalypse has arrived when Garth Brooks is a victim of the collapse of civilization.
That's interesting. Also, an intriguing link to Leave the World Behind,
Aha,
with the sort of the not knowing, yeah, sort of not knowing quite the extent of
yeah.
what's going on, and to the but without the clowns.
Yeah. The clowns are Chemical X in this one.
Yeah, that's well. And also the peat bog thing. I mean, I'm kind of thinking of like Doctor Who and the Quarries. I can imagine that peat bogs would be really useful if you're telling all sorts of stories that are sort of SF in Ireland. So yeah, more post-apocalyptic peat bogs.
Well, in particular, yes, if you're trying to, you've got the last, there's some good car gags in it. How are we going to fit five of us in this thing? Say 5 clowns, but they're driving across a peat bog, of course, and that's not a great way to escape the apocalypse. It's the kind of film that has a credit for something called James Joyce stunt double.
Oh wow! Okay. One for the history books. That's great. So those hit the cutting room floor, and then the other thing which you kind of couldn't fit into Mutant Popcorn for the issue was all of the many thoughts on Poor Things. So I think we should probably move to that, right?
Yes, well, I mean, this is, of course, one of the films that got kicked into a December release in North America, but into January 2024 elsewhere. So, although a lot of people have seen this film by now, it hasn't exactly been a secret. It's been playing all the festivals. There have been the odd the public screen, and I think the verdict is in that this is not just one of the genre films of the year, but one of the films of the year, and will be coming back and haunting us at award season. But it is also, of course, for INTERZONE readers, a hugely important film, as probably the greatest SF novel to have been adapted, certainly since Dune, and impossible to write about economically, because there is so much, both about the film, which is a very rich and complex film, but also about the novel and about the gap between the two of them that can only really be explained by sort of delving back into Alasdair Gray and his relationship with science fiction over a near 50-year career. So there's a huge amount to say about this film, which is, I think, is already kind of taking the world by storm. And it's just nice to have an opportunity to unpack it a little bit further, because, as we were saying at the top of the show, this is an intrinsically unfilmable novel, which hasn't stopped. This is one of the things that's actually got slightly lost, I think, in the narrative around the film. It hadn't stopped people from trying to film it almost as soon as it appeared. The novel came out in 1992, and Gray was at a bit of a low point in his career at that time. He had this amazing trio of hits at the beginning of the 80s with Lanark and his first collection, Unlikely Stories mostly, and then arguably his masterpiece, certainly he always thought so, I think I wouldn't disagree, 1982 Janine. And then there was a big reaction against his next novel, Something Leather, which was a kind of fix-up of old radio plays with rather, as it turned out, rather ill-advisedly spun around the about a fetish element which didn't really kind of mesh with the times. Although I still think it's a fantastic book, and when he repackaged it later as Glaswegians, I think it found a bit more of a sympathetic reception. But he hadn't had a hit for a long time, and then he publishes this novel, which is in many ways an even more kind of deeply Glaswegian novel than Lanark, in that it's all about kind of local, it's a deeply researched local history of the second Scottish Enlightenment in the 1860s and 70s, steeped in local geography and archive stuff, and framed as this nest of voices and forms, and with pastiches within pastiches. But almost immediately it did. And he himself, Gray, was always rather dependent on Scottish arts funding, and he got some money to turn it into a screenplay and shopped it around. I mean, he had some producers he worked with in the period who had also tried to get an adaptation of Lanark made, and it just never got off the ground. But it was never not in development. There was a version in the early 2000s which had Helena Bonham Carter attached as the lead, who would have been absolutely fantastic, actually. I mean, absolutely perfect casting. Jim Broadbent was going to be the mad scientist character. Again, he just couldn't get it made. And then Yorgos Lanthimos approached him. I think in the issue I said it was 2009. It can't possibly have been 2009 because Lanthimos tells this story. I think it must have been more like 2012. Lanthimos tells this story of going to visit Gray, and Gray saying, "Yes, I got one of my." I found someone who was able to insert my DVD of Dogtooth into the drive so that I could watch it. So it must have been after the DVD of Dogtooth had come out.
Okay.
A wonderful, classic Gray story. The man was just a kind of walking shambles. For a kind of Nobel level genius, he did not interact successfully with the world on any level. But Lanthimos tells the story of how he got taken on an author-escorted walking tour of the locations, clearly with a sense that this needed to be shot in Glasgow, and to have the Glaswegianness of it integral to the film. At the end of it, he said, "Well, okay, I think you're a crazy person, and I'll entrust you with the rights." But of course, the film that's come out of it which has a lot of things going for it. I mean, it is an amazing film in its own right. Is deeply un-Glaswegian, and I think Gray would have been horrified at losing that that side of it. But in a lot of other ways, it does preserve things that you wouldn't expect to have been preserved about the novel. Should I be explaining what it's about? I mean, not everyone has kind of lived this novel all their life.
I think so. I feel like it's one of those films where people have you kind of talked around it, and maybe just give people this sort of through line.
Well, it's one of these absolute sort of killer premises. It's about a Glaswegian Victorian mad scientist who rescues a mystery pregnant suicide from the Clyde and transplants the fetus's brain into the adult woman's body, thereby creating a blank slate adult female who develops from infanthood to adulthood at a phenomenal rate, and is completely uncontained by all the various social and gender codes of the age, and carves out her own story across Europe in a kind of feminist palimpsest of the Frankenstein myth, in which the creature takes ownership of not just their creator but everyone else they come into contact with. And it's a joyous film, a joyous novel. It was Gray's first big international hit. He actually it did well in North America, which I think has been one of the things which helped get Searchlight funding for it. It's a great setup, but also a great character, a very iconic a character who is also, of course, a complete treat for an ambitious actor to take on. And Emma Stone, who plays the lead in the film version, does a terrific job of playing the different levels of the heroine Bella's development from this infant just encountering language for the first time to, in the end, this masterful sort of socialist heroine, because socialism, and particularly the Scottish strain of socialism, was a really big part of the novel, and medicine as a way for the elite to do something in the world. And all of these are there in the film. They're in a rather kind of reduced form. The thing that has completely gone is the unreliability of the narration, because the payoff in the novel is that after you've had the main narrative section, which is the memoir published by the male lead character about the heroine, and her voice is heard in an epistolary form. She then gets to do her memoir about the memoir, which completely unpicks it and establishes her rival narrative of what went on. And by the end of it, and the whole thing is framed as a clash between Gray himself as the editor of the total assemblage, who essentially believes the hero's story about Bella, and his also real life friend turned in the novel rival, the archivist, who believes the heroine story against the male authored version that's been written around her. And Gray's original screenplay from 1993 was an absolutely brilliant combination of the two. I mean, he invented this new framing device that has Bella herself reading the first delivered copies of the memoir and saying preposterous, and giving her live commentary on it. And I really regret the loss of that, because the original screenplay, which you can find in Gray's playbook, a Gray playbook from 2009, which I think you can still get. It was a. I'm just going to cross the room and pull out my copy of it. It was a limited edition of how many copies? Limit of 250 signed copies. Mine is number 182, but I think you can actually still get it. It never sold terribly well, and I think you can still probably pick it up for not a huge sum of money. And I've always been in love with that version of it. I've always been in love with the novel, and the subtractions in the film version are one of the things that makes me a little bit. I mean, I think I said in the review it's about sort of 57% as good as the book,
Right.
but the book is very, very good indeed, and. I miss Glasgow. Some of the supporting performances are really not that great. The Hollywood people they got into. Again, to make it more marketable, Mark Ruffalo has had a lot of good reviews because it's certainly a very different role for him. But his accent completely sinks it, particularly when you hear him doing exactly the same accent straight in the Netflix adaptation of All the Light We Cannot See. And Willem Dafoe cannot do who is the only character in the film with any kind of attempt at a Scottish accent. I mean, that was not one of the things he was put on this earth to attempt.
Oh, no.
So it's sort of mixed joys. But on the other hand, Lanthimos has brought in all these extraordinary filmmaking touches of his own. It's set in this, I mean, completely gratuitously, really, in this sort of green screen steampunk Verne alternate universe. It's a very airshipy kind of film, and all the sets and the backgrounds are utterly gorgeous. Doesn't, I think, quite stick the landing. They've tried to improve on the ending, which I think was a mistake. And they seem to have mashed up two different endings and not really kind of decided between them. But it's still, this is a major film of a major novel. Gray himself, oh God, I mean, he was such the word that everyone uses of him was chaotic. I had a lost weekend with him in 1984, his first SF convention. Mexicon 2 was it Newcastle? I can't remember. This was this convention where he where one of the very ambitious things they were doing was inviting as guests authors whom all SF fans were reading, but who hadn't really interacted with the SF community. In the previous year, they'd had famously they'd had Ian Banks along, and that was his famous "These Are My People" moment, which kind of opened up that kind of uncolonized space between his forename and his surname, persuaded him that dusting off "Consider Fleabas" for print might not actually be professional and reputational seppuku. So they'd done very well the previous year, and this year they had in '84 they had Gray and Russell Hoban. And Hoban, I think, he published Ridley Walker, which of course was the novel that all the SF people were reading, but he was working on the Medusa Frequency at the time, and that was very exciting because this was the time of my own kind of peak obsession with the great SF theatre company, Impact Theatre Cooperative. I don't think they thought of themselves as an SF theatre company, but that's what they were. And they were collaborating with him on what became the Medusa Frequency and their landmark production, the Carrier Frequency, which was a different iteration of the same. It was a kind of a Clark Kubrick cross-media collaboration, but Hoban was not a man made for conventions. I think he was a very reticent, cautious deep thinking guy, and I remember sort of sitting down with him and gushing about the Impact Theatre, and he said, "Sorry, who are you? How do you know about that?" I mean, I don't think he quite realised what fan was short for. But Gray was a different kind of proposition again, because I remember I was completely obsessed with him at the time, and when he turned up, I instantly bought his first drink and told him 1982 Janine was the great Scottish novel, which arguably it was and still is. And of course, he's chronically shy with strangers, and he just kind of stammered thanks. Roger Glass, his biographer, has a story about his first encounter with Gray, where he got a kind of tip-off as to which pubs Gray, who liked his spirits, was drinking in, and he just accosted him there, and he got a kind of mumbled dismissal, and that was nearly it. But I had very much the same kind of experience. I bought him a drink, and he kind of stammered his thanks as I was trying to sort of draw him out on his work, and he just kind of drank faster and made his excuses, and so. Everyone was rather astonished when he then transformed almost bodily when it came to do his reading, which was a bit from Lanark, and he became this absolutely stellar, charismatic performer of his own work, doing all the characters, doing all the voices. You see why radio was always a really important theatre, but particularly radio theatre was always an important medium for him. And then by the Sunday evening, he was literally sprawled insensible on the floor of the convention hall. And that was the moment, I think we'd already had that moment, where we all realised that the kind of level of high-functioning, borderline alcoholism that is the normal case, or certainly then was the normal case of most SF authors, was very different from the full-on alcoholism of someone who had never attended a convention before, an author with a significant drink problem, suddenly plunged into the culture of unlimited free drinks from people who think, or in this case know, that you're a genius and just want to buy you drinks for an entire weekend. So that was his lost weekend in fandom, and I don't know if he ever went to another convention, but we saw 3 different Alasdair Grays that weekend, and they were all very much versions of the man he always was. An amazing writer, but also utterly shambolic human being.
Right. Yeah, that's a great story. Just digressing slightly, you mentioned the Ian Banks thing the year before. Can you go into that a bit more, because I think that's super interesting.
Oh yeah, Banks had published, was it 3 novels? He published The Wasp Factory, Walking on Glass, and The Bridge, I think, had The Bridge come out then? But he was, right from The Wasp Factory onwards, he was someone who all the SF fans were reading. I mean, I think we recognised a kindred spirit in him long before he knew there was a kindred spirit in us. And I wasn't at that convention, but that was in 1983, where he was just invited because he was someone who a lot of fans really wanted to meet and cultivate the kind of relationship with that only really existed in SF fandom. And he instantly got it. And he had, of course, been writing what became the culture novels on the side, and never thought, I think, really of publishing them once he had become, a very significant voice in new British fiction, and he just clicked with the SF community and with the way that space opera was seen as a kind of serious art form. And it transformed his career. I mean, it bifurcated his career in many ways, but that was the start of it. And he talked a lot about this over the years. He was never backward about giving credit to fandom for introducing him to the possibility of being simultaneously a genre writer and a writer for people who would never pick up use of weapons in a billion years.
Yeah, two really important Scottish writers right there.
Yeah.
Wow, that's okay. So that's a huge amount there. Where are we? Where do we go next? We're looking ahead. We looked a lot at 2023, and this that's coming out at the beginning of next year in some places. But what else?
Yes.
What else is on the way?
Well, there's a lot of stuff that actually was in the kind of festival round that I was trying to write up in 296 that still isn't out. So a lot of things that. I mean, Poor Things is the big one, and of course, it's Poor Things rather than Poor Things, rhyming with Paw Patrol. Because it has to be very much a, it is a Glaswegian title. But I mean, there's of things coming out imminently that were in that issue. We still, the Boy and the Heron, of course, the Miyazaki is coming out next week, I think. Amazing film. I mean, again, one of those ones I could actually sort of talk about for an hour. It's both absolutely essential Miyazaki and completely minor. There are a lot of things which are the most Miyazaki ever, and other things where you're expecting it to do trademark Miyazaki things, and it simply doesn't. It simply doesn't try. So it doesn't really. It doesn't have the usual kind of emotional arc. It doesn't have a banger soundtrack, but it's full of obsessions. It's really wild and out there, and it's his definitive fusion of his kind of autobiographical sort of World War II roots, including his obsession with fighter planes, and the insane stream of consciousness fantasy, and the way it segues between the two is really bold. And at the same time, it is a film about mortality and succession, and on some level encodes the current state of Studio Ghibli. So it's, I mean, that one's about to hit us. Poor Things coming out fast behind. One to look out for again, I think in January, is The End We Start From, the adaptation of Megan Hunter's novel. Very interesting novel, very kind of almost a sort of Balladian condensed novel about which defamiliarizes the familiar cozy catastrophe British apocalypse novel. Very beautifully done, fantastic anchoring lead performance by Jodie Comer. A film that I've been thinking about almost more than any other in recent weeks. The amazing French film The Beast, Bertrand Bonello's adaptation of the Henry James novella The Beast in the Jungle, which but SF, but not just SF. SF, at least 2 or 3 different kinds of SF, because there's a kind of Poor Things steampunk period layer to it. There's a future kind of quasi-Scientological past lives psychotherapy bit, and the most amazing segment, actually, and the one which you don't realize you've been watching in the intercut timelines until it actually happens, is the one set in kind of near present in LA around the film industry itself. Completely extraordinary film. I think I need to watch it. This is the one, if you remember, you had to print the QR code for the credits because it's decided that credits are too last century.
Yeah, because it had that extra sequence.
Yeah, and you get a bonus scene if you overcome all your conditioning and whip out your phone and snap the QR code before it disappears off screen. But completely extraordinary film. It's been a great year for French SF. I mean, I thought I would not see a better film all year than The Five Devils, which would be a great kind of. How do you describe it? The 9-year-old hyperosmic witch who time slips in a sort of intergenerational queer romance to Total Eclipse of the Heart. But actually, I mean, there was The Beast. There was The Animal Kingdom, which I think doesn't yet have international releases lined up, but this is the great sort of metamorphosis apocalypse where everyone's slowly turning into animals, and you've got a kind of adult and it's a father-son drama, but you've got a kind of adult plot and a teenage coming-of-age plot where everyone is kind of terrified of being ostracized as they start to lose their humanity and embark on this kind of Ballardian journey into what may be the next state of humanity, or may leave us behind in other ways. So that's still to come. One that, again, was in the last issue that I think everyone who sees it just falls in love with is Molly and Max in the Future, which is, I was thinking afterwards, I didn't say this at the time, but it's kind of like a live action episode of Futurama. It's doing all these sort of crazy casual deployments of SF tropes, and just bunging SF, deep science fictional gags about multiverses and interdimensional beings and sort of space operatic interplanetary romance into the remake of When Harry, a very straight ahead remake of When Harry Met Sally. So it's kind of spanning years in the lives of these couples who are having this on-off romance that, and it's very, very cheap. It's very kind of Alphaville style, low budget SF with a lot of pointedly, hilariously cheap effects that nevertheless are very heavily leaned into. So there are all these wonderful things that haven't, I think in some cases haven't even got distribution. I think last time we were talking about how bleak 2024 was looking with the colossal lineup of studio sequels. 2024 now is the year without a proper Marvel film, for example. We've got Deadpool 3 as the only sort of official MCU film, and that's not really full-on MCU because it's a legacy of the Foxverse and has been, it's going to have Hugh Jackman's Wolverine in it. So very much a kind of legacy Foxverse before it becomes full MCU product. And then all the other Marvel films are the bloody Sony Spider-Verse. We've got 3 of these now because they kicked Kraven the Hunter. So as well as the Venom sequel coming up, I think, in the autumn, we've got Madam Web barreling down on us in February. So it's going to be a very strange year for superhero cinema. It's coming at a time, of course, when both Disney and Warner's, in their completely different ways, have been going through radical changes in business strategy. Disney rethinking the relationship between the Disney Plus series and the MCU, particularly after the Marvels tanked. I think undeservedly, because it had a lot going for it, but clearly did not connect with audiences. It expected you to care about Ms. Marvel, which I thought was rather good, and Kree Skrull wars, which I think there was less enthusiasm for, and these were things that had been stoked by the Disney Plus series. But then you've got Warner's kind of cancelling, dumping already completed films, dumping their Batgirl. Another, of course, great loss to Glaswegian cinema.
Right.
They tried to dump the Coyote versus Acme, the kind of Roger Rabbit style courtroom drama about Wile E. Coyote suing Acme for delivering all this faulty equipment that completely fails to catch the Roadrunner, and then there was an outcry, and they reinstated it. But that again, a finished film that nearly got concrete booted and thrown in the Clyde. So 2024 is going to be an odd mix. We've got a lot of sequels, lot of I think possibly franchise products that maybe past their sell-by, but also a lot of really interesting indie stuff. And in amidst it all, there are some things that nobody can wait to see. We've got Dune Part 2, we've got Furiosa. Hard to see how those are not going to be great kind of big budget auteur stonkers. So a lot to look forward to. I should say, of course, in the short term, because the next issue I think will be coming out in January. So there is some quite interesting end of year stuff that obviously hadn't screened at the time of the last issue. But one of the interesting things I was expecting this to be a very boring Christmas. We were going to get an Aquaman and whoever thought that a Wonka prequel would be interesting? But actually, the franchise stuff that's been coming out for the Christmas season is all, so far I haven't seen the Aquaman, but it's all proving unexpectedly interesting. We've got Godzilla -1, which is, I think, one of the great Godzilla films. And the Wonka film, which has come out internationally but not yet in North America, is a really interesting. It plays very well in the UK. It's a very interesting film about what the voice of the increasingly problematic Roald Dahl needs to do, and what it can say to the world of 2023, as well as being a film about all the things that chocolate can signify, about which I just thought very, very deeply. So there's Disney's Wish, which is the film about made by Disney's A-team of Jennifer Lee and Chris Buck, about what Disney means and the entire century-long Disney heritage, and the fact that the film has not, I think, really delivered on its ambitions doesn't stop it being an extremely interesting, for once overt, reflection by Disney on itself. So lots of interesting stuff, even in the blockbuster space.
Mm-hmm. And that's going to be an INTERZONE 297, which is coming out in January. And I wanted to ask you as well. There was a couple of in a couple of the pods where we've spoken. You've talked about Chinese cinema, and you talked about through the sort of seeing it and the experience of seeing it. And I wonder if how was 2023 in terms of Chinese cinema in London?
Well, yes, because London is one of the few places in the UK where big Chinese releases do get a proper theatrical airing, sometimes in really quite big screens, and so you can watch them with a Chinese audience. And I remember this last year with Moon Man, which I still think, we talked about, I think, on an earlier podcast, and is, although it never got into an issue, and this is kind of a parody for the Chinese audience of Chinese blockbuster cinema, and particularly, I think, the original Wandering Earth, which, of course, most people internationally saw on Netflix rather than in cinemas. But this has been it has been a remarkable year for Chinese SF, and seeing things like Wandering Earth 2 or Creation of the Gods with basically audiences of Chinese students in an absolutely packed first weekend screening gives you a kind of appreciation for not only how self-confident I think Chinese cinema is in finding its own audience and not really kind of needing to dance to the Hollywood tune, but also for the kind of distinctness of its narrative values, its thespian values. Actually, there's a kind of performance which the great Chinese stars are really good at giving, which oscillates in very disconcerting ways for Western audiences between goofiness and full-on drama, and the production values are getting very high these days. They still the quality of Chinese CGI often looks a bit shonky by Western standards, but they know how to throw money at productions, and occasionally you get these weird kind of hybrids. I thought Meg 2, of course, the Ben Wheatley Meg sequel, which is basically a film for the Chinese market, with all the things that Chinese audiences like 3D, which never died in China, and has continued to be an important part of blockbuster aesthetics. All these things are completely sort of uncompromisingly there. So it's been a really interesting year for watching what's happening in Chinese cinema with an expat audience that is kind of getting the jokes and is attuned to this rather different kind of cinematic grammar. I'm not sure that it's really kind of colonizing Hollywood in the way that it was, say, 5 years ago, when there was a real concern with trying to make films which play to things like the Transformers films were very big on this, that play to the Chinese market. The thing about China that I think everyone has now realized is that while a Western film can be very successful there if it gets a release, it's very difficult to get the money out. So you don't really make much in the way of profits on a Chinese release. And so I think it's not really part of the business model these days in the way that it was, which means that the kind of native Chinese cinematic voices are starting to sustain themselves really on playing to the domestic and expat audiences, which I can't help feeling is ultimately a good thing. In the last issue, I talked about the amazing 3D animation Deep Sea, which I think will get an international release. See it in 3D if you, ideally in IMAX 3D. Watch the trailer and you'll get a sense of what the best of it is like. I mean, that is very much the product of an animation tradition that has grown up alongside 3D and is thinking about how traditional artisanal ways of creating images, particularly through paint textures and brushstrokes, could have something to say to the grammar of 3D IMAX cinema. Really extraordinary stuff, I think.
Yeah, well, that's or sort of thinking about sort of cinema from around the world. There's also there was Plan 75, which I think was one of the kind of
film.
one of the best things, probably if not the sort of best sort of just sort of as a complete film. I mean, it kind of very, very bleak, but yeah, for me that was a real highlight. And
absolutely one of the films of the year. Yes. For those just joining us, this is the Japanese film about senioricide, about a collectively government managed program of euthanasia for the over 75s, and it's a multi-lead film where a bunch of characters find themselves with very different stories, figures from different generations find themselves caught up in this initially benign sounding but increasingly very, very dark and dystopian system, which provides, amongst other things, a showcase for some veteran Japanese performers to give the performance of a lifetime. Absolutely wonderful film. It's been a great year for Japanese cinema generally, actually. I mean, that was probably the highlight, but Godzilla -1 is certainly another of the films of the year. There have been there's been some great stuff in anime as well. Really, I mean, and you know, it's a year we had a Miyazaki. We're going to get many more of those.
No, I mean, this time is the last one.
Well, you know, he's been saying that for the last 20 years. But yeah, I mean, this one, well, you know, it's 10 years since his last. It's hard to see him doing another feature. I could easily see him doing more, I don't know, Ghibli Museum shorts. I finally got to see My Neighbor Totoro. We got to see the stage version of that a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, how was it?
It's fantastic. I mean, it's. I hope it runs and runs. It's very much a celebration of the soundtrack, amongst other things, but also a film for people. Sorry, a production for people who have seen the film a lot of times, and are wondering how on earth they are going to do in live action with puppetry some of the stuff that is so quintessential about the film, and it starts with the opening credits. They do the opening titles live.
Oh, really?
But also they have done wonderful work with the score, and it is the Hisaishi soundtrack, which is absolutely wall-to-wall bangers. I mean, it is still, I think, the greatest of all the Miyazaki soundtracks, or the greatest of all Hisaishi's soundtracks. It has been very beautifully woven together, with the themes sort of quoting one another and weaving out of one another in a properly kind of full-on, almost kind of fugal score. And I don't think this is a spoiler. The sex of the cat bus has been faithfully preserved. One of the things one notices from the from repeat viewings, that is discreetly present and unmissable in the stage show.
Wonderful. It's good to know, and a good place maybe to wrap things up.
We probably should, shouldn't we? If anyone's still listening to this, go to bed, get a life. What are you still doing here?
Well, yeah. Thank you very, very much, Nick, for coming on again. And I mean, this has been like a bumper show. So I'm looking forward to getting it out, and I'm looking forward to reading the next Mutant Popcorn. If you haven't already subscribed to INTERZONE, you can do that at interzone.press. And the next issue is out. I think it's the 15th of January, if my dates are right. So yeah, look out for that early in 2024.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for having me again. And we'll do this again in another year.
Yeah, for sure. Looking forward to it.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Gareth.